For 20 years, we've been creating innovation in the CX industry, and now we're seeking out brilliant new perspectives on CX you just won't find anywhere else. I'm Richard Owen. Welcome to the CX Iconoclast. What happens when leading-edge academic research meets real-world customer dynamics? Well, in this episode, we welcome Chris Forman, Professor of Strategy, Innovation, and Technology at Cornell's Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management, to explore how technology adoption, data integration, and organizational readiness shape B2B outcomes. Here we talk about the critical differences between collecting data and actually using it, and why even sophisticated firms often struggle to translate tech investments into competitive advantage, especially in the era of artificial intelligence investments. Chris's research around successes and failure rates really caught our eye, especially as he brought an academic and a rather impartial view to what is otherwise an overhyped topic. While there are lots of vendors, as you can imagine, explaining how easy it is to use their platforms, real data around success is a lot harder to come by, let alone the fundamental reasons for success or failure. From early stage AI to platform lock-in, from old ERP, MRP, and Salesforce implementation challenges to the dynamics of central versus local decision-making, Chris brings data-based academic research to questions business leaders implementing AI should be asking today. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Back to Chris. That's great. An interesting topic. So, okay, we've got recording. So if you're ready, we'll just kick off and dive in. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Great. Chris Forman, thank you very much for joining us here at the CX Iconoclast.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, we really do want to get to this topic because you published this recent paper, which is right on point, looking at how enterprises are deploying AI, and I think a lot of the challenges associated with that. But perhaps you could start a little bit by talking about your areas of research that you're focused on right now. Just give some background.
Sure. So my research is more or less at the intersection of information technology, strategy, and economics. And so historically, I've done a mix of, I guess, two broad areas. One is related to firms' use of information technology and when they obtain value from that, under what circumstances. And that's been, I think, the area that I've been working on for the longest time. So way back in the early 2000s, this was around the internet and how the death of distance and, how the interplay between IT and geography and how that influenced firm value. And I've been continuing on that over the years and most recently looking at issues around deployment of AI in business more recently. I think the other area that I've been interested in is, I guess you could broadly call it around platforms and software, which is pretty broad. I think I've been interested in enterprise software firms and their relationship with platforms like SAP, for example, as well as at a more micro level, how users engage in online communities, I guess, more recently. So that's the high point of a bunch of different things, but yeah.
So, 25 years is a good time to sort of reflect perhaps on what you've seen that's different. And now we're talking about AI. Is it different this time, or are you seeing sort of history repeat itself? Because you can make an argument that, and I mean, I started my training in technology in the late 1980s. Obviously, I was only at high school back then. But that's a joke, by the way. It was not true. The RDBMSs, fourth generation languages, companies were starting to try and build their own back then. That sort of got wiped out in the 1990s by packaged software, right? And you're talking about SAP. Nobody builds an MRP2 system from scratch anymore, right? Nobody within their right mind would, and anyone who did is probably living in a world of regret. So we've already had this kind of play out in the 1990s, 2000s, web-based technology, now AI. Is history just rhyming, or are we seeing something different this time?
I mean, as you might expect, there's clearly some things that are very different, and some that we're at the early stages now, but it's likely that some similar issues are likely to play out. At the highest level, when we were talking about, so as you know, technology waves computing has had different effect on organizations, going back from transaction processing in ERP systems, as we were talking about, in the internet. The big issue, one of the main issues early on, was this is a new communication technology that allows people to connect in new ways that were not feasible, and that's obviously led to all sorts of new business models as this thing has evolved over time. With AI, the issue is one of prediction, right? The ability to use models to predict outcomes, and more recently, of course, this has been manifested in generative AI and all sorts of new applications that we haven't seen in the past. As to your second question about what's similar, it's difficult to say because we're at the early stages of things. But historically, with AI, it's useful to draw a distinction between AI that could be used to improve the way we do certain kinds of tasks, right? And so obviously there's been many new applications now of generative AI and white collar work that is now changing the way many of us do our day-to-day work and how we interact with computers and how we write and code and all sorts of things along those lines. There's a second layer, of course, within businesses of how do we integrate the new technology within the core activities of the business. And so within the context of ERP, for example, that was often dramatic process change, right? So if you as a business had a choice between, you could early on at least continue to deploy your own MRP system or write your own software that was optimized for a particular functional area, or you could take advantage of SAP and which would also help facilitate reorganization of processes and interaction between different company units that previously was very, very difficult. There's the potential for AI to do similar types of things, and we're seeing more and more discussion around that, particularly with some of the software vendors thinking about ways of deploying agentic AI within software systems. But we're still at early stages now. If you look at prior to our conversation, I was looking at an OECD report on AI adoption in 2024. And as you can imagine, industries like tech businesses that are in many ways using AI to augment investments that they've already made in a wide variety of areas. I mean, the easiest to think about is, just as an example, Facebook and social media or any one of the platforms. And those are in some ways augmenting many of the investments they've already been making around other types of technology. vis-a-vis, we could call them more quote unquote offline or traditional businesses, manufacturing, services, and the like, where adoption rates are much still relatively lower. That when I say adoption, I'm sure in those types of organizations, generative AI is already being used to help automate and facilitate certain tasks. But again, getting to sort of the core work that the business is doing. And so, I mean, that pattern has played out obviously in earlier technologies. It took quite a while for client server computing to diffuse, longer than people had expected. ERP systems took a while, and as those types of systems deployed in hospitals via electronic medical records, I mean, in many ways, there are similarities between EMR and what manufacturing had been doing 10, 15 years earlier. Then we're even talking about longer time frames. And so
you could argue that's we're not even close to there yet. In that field. I wonder whether or not you'd agree with this. I mean, AI, to some extent, it's tempting to see every technology wage as different, but there is something intrinsically different about AI technology. First of all, it's foundationally a prediction technology, which means at some level, everything it's doing is probabilistic, right? And if you look at that in comparison with an MRP system, and yes, there's elements of MRP, any form of planning, which are algorithmic, but fundamentally, we've been automating workflows. We've been automating process. Now we're starting to create predictions and probabilistic outcomes, which human beings aren't as comfortable with as they are with absolutes, right? If we're building a payroll system, we kind of understand how payroll works or doesn't work if you've got a bug in it. But now we're introducing into the organization probabilistic engines of some form, which means that there's error intrinsic to it. And I just, even in our experience, this idea of introducing probabilities into human decision-making is not a simple fit. People are very uncomfortable with probabilities. They're not used to dealing with them. Ironically, they deal with them in their everyday lives constantly, but they don't quite have it called out as much. So this issue of introducing AI into the enterprise and the sort of social environment around it, which is we've spent 30 years being dosed on the idea that AI is going to take over the world. And indeed, look, there's plenty of narratives in the media saying we've got to be very careful about AI and its damage to humanity, right? Even today, right? It's kind of almost over-dramatized, you might argue. I would argue it's over-dramatized. Are we going to have more challenges, do you think, bringing this type of technology into the workforce than we had with previous technology?
I mean, so there are certainly going to be issues around application of prediction technology, and then likely to vary across sector, for example. So if you're offering a prediction to, let's say, any consumer-related tech company offers some sort of prediction about a video that you might like, for example, or someone you might want to connect with, the cost to getting that is lower than if you're trying to make a diagnosis for a patient in a hospital, just at a very high and coarse level. So there are likely to be issues in the risks and comfort level of applying AI across different contexts that are likely to perhaps slow the application. It's still somewhat early to say, but certainly those risks are likely to be different. There may be, so in terms of developing software, there's also, this is, as you say, this is not necessarily developing. I mean, there is new code developing, but the set of skills that are required to apply these models are different than those of a software developer that we might have seen in the past. And so there's going to be, in the short run, perhaps human capital barriers to deploying AI in certain types of businesses, as well as at the outcome and the differences in the extent to which use of prediction technology is easier or harder.
Let's dive in to this particular paper that you most recently come out, which was examining make versus buy, so decisions that enterprise are making. There's been a lot of research done, I would argue, that says failure rates in AI systems, homegrown AI systems, are very, very high, and that's in some ways not news. I think what is interesting is shedding light on the nature of that problem, right? Why is that the case? And so I'd love your thoughts on that. Perhaps you could sort of summarize what you learned, what the big conclusions were from your research on this.
Yeah, so this very much dovetails with the issues around human capital that we were discussing, that particularly for, let's call them traditional types of enterprises, it may be, in the short run, difficult to obtain all the skills you need to deploy homegrown AI. And so we were interested in this question of whether what we were calling ready-made software, which you could either think of being software from a vendor or software that's being produced outside of the company by some third party more general, whether that could help substitute for a lack of homegrown expertise. Now, it's difficult to observe all of those different elements, observing skills, observing the types of software that are being deployed. And so what we did is we used survey data from a collection of European firms, and we looked at, so this was a few years back in data from 2020, and we were interested in understanding the extent to which these firms deployed AI using ready-made software, whether they developed in-house, and whether those things tend to co-occur together, or whether you see more of one versus the other, right? And so at a broad level, you can think of our in-house and ready-made software, or make versus buy. Are they substitutes or complements for one another? Does one get used in place of the other, or do they reinforce? And so, and we looked a little bit about how this varied across the sector of firms. And so I think the high level takeaways is that, one, the companies that were doing in-house software were some of the usual suspects that you might expect to be on the leading edge of technology, IT firms, scientific and technical firms, finance, whereas some other sectors that we don't typically think of being lead users of technology, like construction, for example, and human health, preferred to buy systems. In terms of this question about substitution versus complementarity, there was variance. There were differences across sectors, but most sectors were more on the complementarity side of things. So they were using both make versus buy. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the data, we weren't able to sort of say exactly why that was. We saw the paper as one as hopefully opening the door to encourage others to look at this topic. But you could speculate on a couple of different reasons. One is maybe just in terms of functionality, you need much like enterprise software, maybe you would have some ready-made software that you purchase, but you need some types of add-ons or some types of functionality that aren't in the ready-made software. And so you needed to deploy the two together. There may also be some benefits of having in-house expertise around AI that may help you to develop or may help you to use ready-made software more efficiently. And so it helps to have some skills around AI, even to use ready-made software. And that's something that we've seen in prior generations of technology and in other settings around innovation more generally. So that's sort of a high-level view toward what we were looking at.
I mean, first of all, I mean, I would make the argument that it's a question of where the line gets drawn, right? There's no such thing as people really building everything. You're standing on the shoulders of a variety of technology stacks, and the question is where you draw the line. And nobody's going out and saying, well, okay, I'm going to try and recreate the functionality in Azure or AWS or OpenAI. I'm taking these technology sets, and to some extent, I'm doing a form of integration or development. So your argument around building on top of things is, I think, always the case. But I think I'd make a couple of points in relation to that. First of all, when it comes to algorithm development, there's a big advantage from companies that are serving multiple tenants in that they get to see way more data across way more companies, right? So if you're building an algorithm that's designed to create predictive accuracy, like large language models do, large language models are training on the entire internet. That's a big plus. If I wanted to build my own and train it off, a set of data on my PC, it wouldn't be very good. If a corporation can't train models on its own data and expect to be as accurate as engines that are capable of building algorithms, even that they don't necessarily train on the specific data sets of multiple companies, they have an advantage in that they have an ability to refine models based on experiences across multiple companies. And so both the techniques and the algorithms are going to be better. And that's not a question of the company could catch up. They can't, right? They're intrinsically struggling because they are one enterprise, and that gives them relatively limited access to data. So they're almost at a disadvantage from the start. The second argument I think that comes up is the human capital argument as you're raising it. I think there's almost an inverse effect right now with human capital in that people within companies want AI projects on their resume, right? If you're an IT department, your immediate goal is to persuade people in the enterprise to fund AI initiatives because this is your meal ticket. And there's a strong internal bias towards, oh, we can do that, right? Now, whether that expertise really exists, given the failure rate, suggests that it doesn't. But it's politically motivated and quite logically. I don't mean to sound negative in that IT departments or internal teams want to do this. And so you've got this interesting combination of fundamental disadvantage in terms of their ability to do it, combined with strong political motivations to do it. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised we're seeing high failure rates, right? This seems to me like a recipe for failure rates.
Yeah, those are great points. I'll make a few comments. So I think you raised a great point that all of these companies are building on top of a larger stack. And to be clear, it was difficult in these data to observe use of low code, no code tools that may be playing almost certainly are playing a major role here. And that's something that we'd like to look at in future work. But certainly that's going on in the background. The question about data is a really interesting one. There's almost echoes of, again, getting back to historical technologies, that this is the way this comes out is a bit different. But one of the benefits of, and here I'm just speaking off the top of my head, of using SAP, for example, was that these companies, SAP, Oracle, and the like, had the accumulated experience of many, many deployments built into their systems. And so they knew, quote unquote, best practices in a way that perhaps any individual company wouldn't know. That's not exactly the same as having more data, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
But let me pick you up on that, because I think that what you're referring to here is important, which is that there are areas of domain expertise, right? And that's associated with best practices and processes. And I think this idea that AI is divorced from domain knowledge is a mistaken belief, right? I think that maybe it's because we're used to thinking of general purpose technologies, GPTs, like Chat GPT, and we think of it as being all-knowing, all-seeing. But in application for the enterprise, especially in fields of analytics, there is domain. And so in the same way SAP built enormous domain around MRP, especially build to stock MRP, you're going to see, if you're a CRM company, let's use Salesforce as an example, it's a fair bet they're going to understand a lot better about building algorithms for sales forecasting as a domain expertise set than you're going to learn by kind of looking it up in a textbook or based on your personal experience.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and yeah, it raises an interesting question about how the market is going to evolve, in that are we going to see many SaaS vendors that are perhaps using foundation models as inputs and then adapting them to individual circumstances, or are we going to see a replay of SAP through? I mean, there's a number of vendors now that are trying to. Salesforce is one, ServiceNow is another. I think Google as well are also trying to play a role in the enterprise here and provide sort of a more holistic view, and are likely to have that expertise from being in this domain for a long time. And so this is likely to play an important role. I agree, in many different environments. It's going to be fun to see how exactly it plays out.
So notwithstanding all of that, when you reflect now on both your historical research and also the specific piece of research you were doing, how do you see this space evolving? So if we're having this conversation 5 years from now, it seems like a reasonable time frame to evaluate it. I know this is totally speculative, but let's speculate, right? So 5 years from now, what are we going to be looking back on? How is this going to have unfolded? First of all, I mean, I assume you're an optimist about AI intrinsically, but the pessimistic streak is we're going to make a lot of mistakes on the road. The optimistic assessment is, well, companies are going to learn faster than they did in the past, or the nature of the technology means they're going to move faster. And we're going to be in a much better place 5 years from now. What are your thoughts?
I think it's going to depend a great deal. It's going to vary a great deal across sectors. I mean, I think right now, if you look at there's a large number of areas, not only in consumer tech, but knowledge work that can relatively easily be automated. That we're already seeing lots of stories and lots of early stages perhaps, but a great deal number of success stories as well. And so I think those environments where you are trying to automate and employ, and when I say automate, I should be more precise and say to deploy prediction in particular applications or workflows in given settings, particularly those that are inherently knowledge work related. I think we're going to see much faster deployment. And indeed, we even have seen faster deployment and a lot of successes as well. In these settings where in domains that are more, sort of not on the leading edge of knowledge work, let's say, manufacturing, certain services industries, health in particular. I am an optimist that there's a great deal of potential opportunities, and we're starting to see those already, but it's going to take, it may take a bit longer. I think in particular when we try to employ AI as part of a broader, to take your example about customer relationships, broader customer service, for example, and you're stitching together many individual processes, many individual data sets, that may take a bit more time. And I think in 5 years, I do think it's going to be faster than what we saw in some of these historical examples that we've been talking about. Maybe in 5 years, I think that's a pretty good timeline to think about. We're likely to see a lot more in some of these other settings, but it will take a bit more time to figure out what's the what are the barriers that we're going to overcome. I think I think a lot of firms already have their data in order, so some of the issues around, or have their data in order, let me qualify that, better than they did for ERP, for example. And so many of the issues around disparate data and stitching those together may be lower, and certainly are going to be facilitated by AI as well. So it may be faster than we've seen in the past, but I think it's going to take some time. Is this going to be, an underlying question, or a subpart of your question is, what's the market structure going to look like in AI? Are we going to see a great many AI firms like we've seen many SaaS software companies, for example? So is this going to be an environment where we see lots of providers helping to deploy AI in individual workflows that are stitched together? Or are we going to see a larger role for bigger platforms that interface with these SaaS firms? That's going to be really an interesting question.
It's I think that there's going to be, I mean, to some extent, we're in the era of the unknown again, right? There are things we can look back in the past and learn from, but there are so many unique elements to this that we can expect that again, history might rhyme. It's probably not going to repeat itself in this regard. So very, very interesting, and I think it'll be interesting to see how over the next few years it turns out as this gets adopted. Clearly, if you think the stock market's a massive discounting mechanism for the future, stock market's already decided, and it's already priced in enormous success somehow.
Yeah.
But I think the areas where we're seeing the most immediate traction are the ones where, as you said, creative personal tools. really there's a limit to that. I mean, I think personal productivity can be really enhanced, but at some point, corporations with much slower turning circles are going to find ways to make this successful. And the pace of development of the platforms and technology is, I would argue, much faster than we've seen in the past.
Yes.
Right. And maybe that's because of capital formation, but it's not the same as it was in the 1980s and 1990s. And so that should give us cause for optimism.
Absolutely.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for your comments. I think it's a fascinating area. And I think if you keep this updated as you go, I think you're going to have a really interesting narrative, not just from the perspective of the 25 years you've been sort of looking at this, but even the next 5 years, I think is going to teach us a lot. So I'm going to be very intrigued to see how you feel it pans out over the next few periods. So thank you again very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. It's been a fun conversation, and lots of good things to think about.
Thanks for listening to the CX Iconoclast from OCX Cognition. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you won't miss any of our thought-provoking conversations. And please get in touch if you want to learn more about what OCX Cognition's predictive CX analytics platform can do for your business by providing complete insights into every account, continuously updated and connected to operations. You'll find contact info in the show notes.